this may actually interest you, but a couple weeks ago I gave a speech at Columbia University, and sort of there's been this sea change in the Chinese student community there, where after the COVID protests at the end of last year, it's called the white paper protests. For a lot of Chinese students abroad, that really was kind of a wake-up moment where they are kind of actively turning against the Chinese Communist Party. I would not have been able to just come and give a talk there at Columbia University, 20 years ago. But yeah, there's just an entirely different level of support for critical voices of the Chinese Communist Party. So I think that's pretty encouraging, the change that's happened.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we noticed a good deal. I think you're right, and I think COVID was a significant trigger on that. I mean, there's always been, I think, a pocket of students here that have spent some time here and realized, okay, a lot of what they told growing up is, as my grandfather would say, hogwash. But yeah, I think COVID was a wake-up call. And you saw sort of the white paper protests, right? Even on American university campuses, 2 years ago. And so that is encouraging.
And
yeah, there's a lot of Chinese people who are like in their 50s who came here in the 80s to study. And then after the Tiananmen Square protests, they ended up staying because the president had given this executive order to allow people to stay and not have to go back to China. And so there's that was the wake-up call for that generation, right? But there wasn't that many Chinese people in the U.S. at that time. Like, if we talk to a lot of those people, they're like, yeah, I stayed because of Tiananmen. And then now you have this new and much larger group, I think, that's having their own, 30 years later, very different
there were lots of Chinese people in the country before that. But that was mainly a lot of people who fled, southern China and stuff, fleeing the CCP when it was beginning to come in power.
Oh, no, sorry, I meant the people who came in the 80s to get their PhDs and stuff.
Gotcha. That was a smaller group. Yeah. Well, speaking of COVID, I think it was in that Falun Dafa Information Center report, but it seemed like COVID was actually a trigger for even greater suppression of Falun Gong in China and abroad. What happened there?
So, all right. So this is an important topic. The broader story is that the persecution of Falun Gong, one of the ways I think of it, is gone through three phases in terms of how the CCP has suppressed information. The first was just to justify the persecution to everybody. Once the level of atrocities had sort of started to build up, organ harvesting, large-scale torture, sexual abuse, death from torture, it became a cover-up. And that's sort of right in the 2002, 2003 area where they went rather suddenly from a very overt kind of cultural revolution style campaign to total silence. Everything went underground. And then it became sort of like, we got to cover this up. We can't let the world see this. What happened, what started about then has been going on up until today. And so that's sort of the last 15, 16, 17 years is what we would call the largest, or what is the largest civil disobedience movement in the world inside China. And that is literally tens of millions of Falun Gong practitioners running their own underground media, essentially, creating leaflets and pamphlets and under cover of night, putting them on doorsteps across China, small villages, big cities, everywhere. And so in many ways, the Falun Gong has become sort of this grassroots movement for exposing the CCP. And so anytime something bad happens, like let's say hypothetically the CCP is covering up the real story of COVID, the first group they're going to go after is the Falun Gong community, because that network of individuals, that grassroots network in China, has become very proficient in getting information out of China and also getting reports from around the world into these leaflets and into the front doors of people all throughout China. So what you saw in COVID, and you see this in other sort of sensitive times, is that they really went after Falun Gong in order to silence that network so people aren't being told what's really going on with COVID. I think Feng Bing is the example, one of the clear examples where he was in Wuhan and he was sort of taking videos of all the people that were dying and being cremated, and he's sort of sending that out to the world. Well, he's a Falun Gong practitioner. And they were quite worried about that kind of thing. And so COVID is one of the things that made suppression and sort of the roundup of Falun Gong increase a great deal.
So one interesting thing about that is it's essentially sounds like the Communist Party pushed Falun Gong into being sort of political against the CCP in a way that wouldn't have happened if the CCP just left Falun Gong alone.
For sure. I think what actually happened, I think that that's generally the correct characterization. I mean, I think the way that unfolded is that in the early years of the persecution, there was this movement to just tell the people in China what was happening to them. And so if someone was beaten to death or tortured to death in a labor camp, people would go out into that village or that town and say, this is what happened, this is who did it, and they'd try and explain it to them. But they were hitting a brick wall. And that brick wall was that, I think throughout the Falun Gong community in China and even outside China, we realized that people just weren't going to listen. They were so indoctrinated with the CCP that the CCP might have done some bad stuff, but they were so indoctrinated, they just weren't going to listen. And I think learning that lesson, a lot of the people in China said, okay, if we're going to get this message across and tell people what's really happening to us, I guess we have to first tell people the truth about the CCP. And so they'll get the idea that everything they've been told is not necessarily correct. And that's what really started, with at least within the Falun Gong community, this idea that, hey, we're going to talk about the CCP more broadly. We're going to talk about its real history, all the violent campaigns it's unleashed on the Chinese people, all these things that the Chinese people themselves have never learned about. We're going to tell you that because that's the thing that's blocking people from understanding what's happening to us, the Falun Gong communities, and the persecution. So that's sort of really what happened, and that's what sort of morphed essentially a persecuted group into this huge movement of civil disobedience to really expose the CCP more broadly.
So I guess kind of like what Shen Yun is doing kind of came out of that idea about telling people about what China is and isn't?
Sort of, yeah. I think so. I mean, I think there was a real, recognition, certainly within the Falun Gong community, but probably beyond that. Is that, I mean, for decades, the CCP has been trying to destroy Chinese culture, which is a very spiritual culture, entirely, right? So they can impose Marxism on the people. So that's been going on for decades. And I think when they went after Falun Gong, in some ways that was sort of the final nail in the coffin to obliterate authentic Chinese culture entirely. And so I think for the artists that started Shen Yun, they're looking at this from a cultural perspective, sort of a history and language perspective, and going, we are about to witness the complete destruction, the final eradication of authentic Chinese culture, something that's been on this earth for 5,000 years. We can't let that happen. And so they really started Shen Yun to say, this is a very beautiful culture. It's profound. It's spiritual. We really need to, first of all, restore this, revive it so it's not lost on the face of the earth. But then let's share that with the world in a beautiful way. And so that's what Shen Yun, they really came at it from a cultural perspective and wanting to not let the Chinese culture die.